All right, well, for the last time today, welcome back. Alongside Helen Zhang, I'm Christopher Harrison, and this is Adding Style with CSS. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about CSS, obviously. See, it's not just a clever title after all. But one of the things that we've seen, even though a lot of our CSS files have been relatively straightforward, is that those files can get really big. And trying to identify the different elements and all those different properties, that can become very verbose and sometimes very tricky and not quite as powerful as we might like. Is there something else that we can use?
Yeah.
He asked as a leading question.
I mean, I think after you play with CSS for a while, you do run into the issue of like, there's a lot of clutter here. This style sheet is getting awfully long. Man, I wish I could reuse some of this code instead of having to copy it over just to change some properties.
Yep.
And that's been a burden for a long time. I mean, CSS is a relatively old language. So a couple years ago, people have come up with various groups have come up with CSS Preprocessors, which are, I mean, it's not a different language, mind you. It's more like slightly different syntax for CSS just to help enable you to do more things. So there are, three major preprocessors out there. There's Less, there's Sass, and there's Stylus, and we're going to talk about sort of some of their differences. We're going to talk about why they're used, why you need preprocessors, if you need preprocessors, and if you want to use one, which one should you choose? We're also going to go through some simple example usage.
Okay.
Yeah, so let's start with the big question. What is a preprocessor? The simple way to explain it is that it basically extends your vanilla CSS with extra features. So you've seen us use CSS all day today. I wouldn't say that's everything that's in CSS, but that's the bulk of it. You haven't really seen anything with like variables or with us nesting selectors, and that's because those things don't exist in CSS right now. And they're things that people really, really want. I mean, could you imagine instead of you saying, okay, for all of the list items within nav, do this. Instead, you just have do this in nav, and then if there are list items underneath, do this other thing. That seems pretty intuitive, right? Mm-hmm. But that's actually not something that's within CSS, these nesting selectors. And so that's something that's included in every preprocessor out there. I mean, these basically just wrap up the features that people have been asking for in CSS, some loops, some variables, some custom functions, maybe some calculation functions for color and math. And basically wrapping that up into a preprocessor so that you'll write things in something that looks and feels like a better version of CSS, but at the end of the day, it does compile down to standard CSS so that it's easy to write, but it's also easy for browsers and clients of all shapes and sizes to actually be able to use. So it's really making it easy on the developer while still having that same outcome be true for your users, which I think is the best case.
Yeah.
It does include, of course, an extra step. I mean, you write things like this, and then you have to compile them, which is not strictly true for one of them. We'll talk about that later. And it's this extra step. So there is this question of, do you need a preprocessor? Why should you use a preprocessor? Well, it does give you that cleaner, more reusable code. It has all of those flexibility and features that we just talked about, and they actually make a lot of things more easily like cross-browser compatible. But if you're just starting out in CSS, it might be good, it might be best actually to learn all of the ins and outs of CSS first. If you have a relatively simple page or you have a relatively simple development flow, you don't necessarily need all of that.
Right.
I mean, if you haven't looked at your code and said, oh man, I could really use a variable here for the background color, maybe you don't need one. Maybe you don't need a preprocessor. And I would never want to push anyone into using a preprocessor if they don't actually need it, especially if you're just starting out with CSS. It's good to learn the best practices. I'm not saying you should live through the painful parts to get to the good parts. I'm saying you should see if it's actually necessary in your life.
Right.
Because it is an entire different skill set, and you have to find different documentation, things like that. Oh, another really great thing about preprocessors is actually that a lot of them come with sort of like mixed these things called mixins, or these sort of like libraries of features and components that you can sort of add in. So if you guys have used jQuery in the past, you'll notice there are a lot of like other jQuery libraries that are available for you to add in mobile features or sort of grid feature, or maybe not grid features. That would, I was just making things up. But yeah, mobile features, or maybe like canvas features, draw features, things like that. There are also these libraries out there for every preprocessor as well. And those tend to also make things easier because you don't have to write everything yourself. You can reuse code that other people have created, that's been tested, that works well. And you can also have more code reuse for yourself. So instead of like defining the same variable 1,000 times for these different things, you can kind of lump them in together and maybe just call that with a function for a color under each of them.
Okay.
So it's all under that whole don't repeat yourself sort of mindset. Okay.
No more copy and paste.
No more copy and paste. You've seen us do a lot of that today, so you know it's necessary.
Yeah.
And I want you to know it doesn't have to be true.
Right.
So there are 3 major preprocessors out there. They're less, SAS, and stylus. They all have sort of different philosophies on what are best practices. They also have different advantages and disadvantages. I don't want to go into too much of the nitty-gritty today about how do I use each one? How are functions different in each one? But I just want to talk generally sort of about what their philosophies are, what are some of their advantages, disadvantages, who benefits from using each one. So yeah, let's start by talking about sort of variables and syntax. As we said before, I mean, basically CSS preprocessors, they're just same language, different syntax, right? So why not talk about syntax? And for the most part, the syntax is very similar to CSS syntax. You still, with the exception of stylus. But okay, let's just start with less for now. In less, you can of course create variables, like you can in all these preprocessors, and you basically prefix your variables with an @ sign, with an @ symbol, so you know that those are variables and not just properties. And you assign values to those variables or to whatever else with a colon, much like you do in CSS. In fact, the syntax of less is most like CSS, and this even extends down to how they create like loops and things like that, which does actually make it a bit less intuitive to users than if you had sort of a more JavaScript-like directive. So for instance, when you're saying, hey, apply this property if this is true, you're saying, apply this property when this is true. And they wanted to style that sort of after the way media queries are styled, which, I mean, their entire philosophy is, what would CSS do, basically? What would CSS do if it did all of these features that we wanted? And that's sort of its philosophy. For SAS, variables are prefixed as well, but they're prefixed with a $ instead. So it's a bit more JavaScript-like. And values are still assigned with the colon. The syntax is pretty similar to CSS, just like less, but they have more like JavaScript-like directives. So if you're wanting to use an if, there's actually an if function that you can call, and there are loops that you can call, like while loops, for loops, etc. Whereas that doesn't exist as much in less, because less is of the opinion that that's not a thing that CSS would do. Like, we don't really want to do that, but there are ways that you could do that. You can call a recursive function to call itself, and it's more complicated, right? And so I guess the difference between those two are just that less is more CSS-like in syntax slightly, and SAS is more JavaScript-like in syntax. And you can even see that with variables being prefixed with a $. That's very jQuery-like, which is something that we're all sort of used to. And stylus is sort of the one that's a bit different. Variables don't need prefixes in stylus. If you want a variable, you just say x equals something, and there you have it. You have a variable. Their syntax generally is very, very minimal. So I said this is most similar to JavaScript. This is true in the sense that you can have, so like in JavaScript, perhaps this is this is a little known fact, but you don't necessarily need semicolons. You should definitely have them. But JavaScript, like if you leave off a semicolon, it's not the end of the world.
It really is, yeah. Outside of just a few edge cases, JavaScript will work just fine without semicolons.
Yeah.
Still have them though.
Yeah, exactly. Don't take that for an endorsement to not have them. But I mean, in terms of variables being assigned with equal signs, in terms of variables like not needing prefixes, it's just very simple. And in fact, I would say the syntax is not just similar to JavaScript, it's extremely, extremely similar to CoffeeScript. So if you're someone who has used Ruby before, you really like CoffeeScript, or you're like a really concise person and you want your code to be the smallest possible, that gives you that like really good feeling, yeah, Stylus is probably for you because it is by far the least verbose. It's worth mentioning that Stylus will, of course, process your code properly if you have the full CSS syntax. So Stylus doesn't need curly braces, but if you add curly braces in, it's fine. It doesn't need semicolons, but if you add semicolons, it's fine. It all basically works on indentation more than anything else. So I guess I should have really said it's most similar to CoffeeScript, not JavaScript itself. So in terms of writing in these different syntaxes, I should say, in these different preprocessors, I would say those are the differences. Less is most similar to CSS, Sass is most similar to JavaScript, and Stylus is most similar to CoffeeScript. It's like most concise by far. And I'll show you an example usage of all this. I'll actually show you how code, or how my earlier CSS code looks refactored into this. So let's do that. I realize now that I closed Visual Studio earlier, so I just need to bring up my old files. Hopefully that is not too hard. Oh, it's really not. I called it preprocessor.css. And I'm going to bring up my original style.css just for comparison. Right, okay, so this first part is the less syntax. Now, right off the bat, what we talked about is that you can have variables, and those variables are prefixed with an @ symbol. I mean, this is sort of a basic variable. I just used it for background color for the header. And you assign the variable in the beginning, and you can use it here. The variables for all of these work in much the same way. They're all sort of scoped in the way that variables are scoped in JavaScript. So, if something is defined within header, that's used first, and then if it's not, it cascades up.
Okay.
I suppose. So yeah, but what you can see here is that this looks an awful lot like CSS. I mean, if you look over here, it's very similar. So what are the differences? Well, the major difference, besides the fact that I apparently cut off all of body, is that in here, in header, you see how in header, even though I put these elements nested under header, they're not actually nested within this header block.
Right.
Right? Whereas in this less syntax, I don't need that header to be prefixed before the li, because it's saying, because if this li item is within this header block right here, then it automatically does sort of if this is a descendant list item of header, then do these things.
Okay, so the header winds up becoming the container, and then you can set, hey, if it's inside of there, this is how I want you to look.
Yeah, and I mean, these two things, sort of the variables and this nested syntax, are some of the most frustrating things, which is why we have them in here. And I did the same for the link elements here. And you'll actually notice I have this % here. This refers to basically a parent. So the parent of this is this A here. And so this basically just translates that over. If I had this up here, then this would refer to header. And that just says, hey, have the answers to this, do this. It doesn't look very shortened since it's only replacing an A, but believe me, if this was, like a much larger selector, much more complex selector, you'll be thankful that it's sort of there and that it's more concise. So that's what this syntax looks like for less. And if you scroll down a little bit, this is what the syntax looks like for Sass. I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm going to mention this now. Sass actually has two sort of syntaxes. There's Sass. So if you're writing Sass files, you can end things in two extensions, .sass or .scss, which is sassy CSS. They're very sassy.
I see what you did there. And, I have to say, up to now, I'm very disappointed. I haven't done my standard less is more joke, just because I haven't found the right opportunity. So I will throw that pun in a little bit later. So in any event.
Yeah, I mean, Sass is, I think Sass, just by virtue of the organization name, has the best / most puns. They were throwing out conference names like Keeping It Sassy 2014, things like that. It's cute. I mean, if CSS is all about style, Sass has a lot of style.
There you go.
Yeah. So, right. What I was talking before is Sass has two sort of syntax styles, and this branched off a couple of years ago, but this is the preferred style. The sort of more verbose is the more preferred Sass style. And they also have one that's much less verbose, much more stylist-like, but that's not nearly as much in use anymore. They sort of thought, oh, maybe this is what people want, but then they kind of went back to their original format. So occasionally you'll see Sass examples be extremely concise, and that's the reason why. It's because there were these two formats, but this is I wouldn't say it's a canonical, but I would say it's a preferred. Mm-hmm. But if you compare this Sass syntax now with the less syntax up here, it looks exactly the same, with the exception of this. So the only real difference that you can see here is that, hey, there's a dollar sign here for denoting a variable instead of that @ symbol. But other than that, yeah, it's used here. It's still a dollar symbol. It nests in the same way. The list item, the A are all under header, and even the ampersand, sort of the placeholder for parent element, is the same. So right now, there are not a lot of syntactical differences, I think on a very basic level. And I think, so if you're trying to choose on syntax, Sass and less so far come out fairly evenly. But if we come down here and we look at stylus, whoa, that looks way different.
That looks very different.
Yeah.
No curly braces.
No curly braces at all. There are no semicolons ending these lines. You don't even need. You don't actually even need the colon in between sort of the property and the value.
That's really weird.
Yeah, you basically don't need to write anything. I left one in here. I'm going to pretend like I left that in here because, as I said, you can, but I actually just forgot to delete it out. But yeah, it's extremely concise. You don't need like these semicolons. You don't need very much at all. And again, it nests in the same way. It all is just based on indentation now instead of the curly braces. But we like to have our good indentation anyway. And again, the sort of parent placeholder is still the ampersand. That's just the preferred way to do that in all preprocessors. So yeah, syntactically, this seems really lightweight, right? I mean, it seems there's so many less lines than there are for these other ones. But again, this is not nearly as much like CSS as the other ones, even though they'll all compile down to pretty much the same thing. They'll compile down to something that looks like this. Yeah, if syntax is something that's important to you, this is how they might look different. So with syntax out of the way, I mean, that's not the only consideration. Whoa, sorry. There are also a lot of general differences between sort of the three big preprocessors. So let's start with who has the largest community. Sass by far has the largest community.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's due in part to a couple of different things. Less has a community that's quite large as well. Sass and less are always neck and neck, and then stylus is smaller, but their following is very loyal, just because it's specific for a reason, right? People who love CoffeeScript, who love Ruby, love stylus because it has all of those things that they're looking for in their syntax. It's concise, it's short, it's exactly like what they have. You don't need all those pesky things if you don't want them, syntactically speaking. But it's still really full-featured. So Sass has the largest feature set. And by that, I mean, it has all of the loops that you're looking for. It has ifs, it has whiles, it has for loops, it has conditional like mix-ins, it has all of these different things. And basically, if someone can, this is not strictly true, I'm exaggerating here, but essentially if there's a new feature that they think will be useful, they'll include it in Sass. So it's extremely versatile. And added to that, it's supported by something called Compass, which is basically like a CSS framework / library for Sass. So that so you can import. So that's already a repository of all these popular mix-ins, which are basically like snippets of code that you can then inject in. So you can say, for instance, I want. You have 3 different classes, and you want sort of like font to be red, the text to be large, something else. You don't want that to be added as a class. You can add that as a mix-in in 3 different classes. So you define it once, and then you basically inject it in these other ones. And that's like the most basic type of mix-in. There are also crazy huge ones that you can get from these libraries that do a lot of the CSS heavy lifting for you, such as like anything from aligning your grids to doing resets to whatever else. And Compass is a repository of all of these different mix-ins. So you have this really robust sort of support network of features, of these other things that you can use, much like sort of the jQuery community. Except the jQuery community is actually pretty disparate, right? There's not like really one repository that you can go to say, hey, I want a mix-in. I suppose then Sass is much more like NPM. It's like the node package manager, right? Or like any package manager. You say what you want, you go in, there's probably a million things for that, and you can get it from this one centralized place. Whereas Less also has a lot of mix-ins. Mix-ins are available in all of these different things, but there's no central repository for Less mix-ins. There's, some guy over here created something, some guy over here created something. You can go to their sites, you can download them, and there have been some, and there are some libraries for Less, mix-in libraries for Less, but they're not. Since it's not centralized, and since there's 2 or 3 of them out there, it's not really as sort of easy to use. You have to search in different places for different things, and there's no clear winner yet. But it is, and Less has like less features than Sass. I mean, I don't mean to say that in a bad way, because Less is actually really careful and conservative about the features that they do put in. So they don't try to put in anything extraneous. As I said before, Less wants to do what CSS would do. You write Less like you would write CSS. CSS wouldn't put in loops. Less doesn't have loops. If you want to do loops, you can, but it's not recommended. So it's really the most true. And when CSS like implements new things, it does tend to be very Less-like. So, I mean...
See, so less is more.
Less is more.
Yes, I managed to work that in. Go me.
Nice. And we've talked a lot about Bootstrap today. And so Bootstrap is actually built on top of Less. It does work with Sass, but actually, the creators of Bootstrap wrote all of their CSS things in Less, and that's how it's compiled.
Right.
And so you can actually access all of those Less files. And modify them, and it has a really large following because of its really close tie to Bootstrap, among other things. And as I said, it does work beautifully, and it doesn't lack any features that you would want. I mean, it just lacks sort of like some niche features that are nice to have. And the one really cool thing about Less is that it can be run in the browser.
Really?
I'm going to let that hang for a second, because that sounds really confusing. Like, what do you mean it can run in the browser? CSS runs in the browser. Well, I'm going to show you sort of how that works. So I don't have a compiled Less file for this, and I don't actually have, sorry?
Oh, no, go ahead. I was just simply going to mention, a lot of people have asked actually kind of 2 questions. Number 1 is about Visual Studio support. So which of those 3 does Visual Studio give you support for?
I know for sure that Visual Studio supports Less. I don't know about the other ones.
It does do Sass. It doesn't do Stylus.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't do Stylus. And then a lot of other people are asking, okay, so you go and you create the Less file. How about actually then compiling that into CSS?
There are so when you go on to the LESS site or to the SAS site, they'll have instructions for how to download this, and I can actually show you what that looks like on their sites. They have like pretty robust instructions. What I'm going to show you in a bit after I show you this is how you don't actually have to do that. So SAS has a compiler that you can install and has command line. You have to really run these yourself to like compile these files down. And for the most part, it's true for LESS. It's definitely true for Stylus, but there are also things that you can use, these projects that people have built to automatically compile files down when you're running, and there's a million third-party things like that out there to make your life easier. But LESS is special because you don't have to do that. And so so theoretically, if I had just a LESS spreadsheet ending in .less, this is what I would do, just in my HTML file. I would say, instead of text/CSS, I would say text/less. And then over here, instead of style.css, let's pretend my file was called style.less.
Okay.
Right? And then LESS actually has a less.js that you can include in here. If you go to their site, less.org. It's loading. And you can actually see they have this client-side usage. There's this less.js that you can download, and you basically just include that as a file like this, assuming I had it in here, of course.
Right. So you would download that or pull it maybe from a CDN.
Yeah. Okay. And once you have these two things in here, it'll automatically just it won't compile, but it'll convert all your code over, and so all your CSS styles that you wrote in LESS will just work out of the box, which is super cool. It's not performant at all. It's nice for testing. Yeah, they say, hey, you can use like this client. You have client-side usage, but even they say, hey, we recommend pre-compiling first.
Okay.
But it's nice for testing. I mean, it's so straightforward. And if you want to just sort of try preprocessor out without installing other things, hey, you only need 2 files. You need a file of LESS that you wrote yourself, and you need sort of the LESS script.
Okay.
So it's very cool. And Stylus is something that you have to compile yourself, much like LESS. So there's nothing as cool about that, or nothing as cool in SAS and Stylus for the browser.
So there's no Java preprocessor or JavaScript preprocessor for SAS or Stylus.
Yeah, exactly. Or there's nothing that's sort of first party, easy to use. That you can compile things yourself. If you're writing a JavaScript project and you're using Grunt, something like that, it'll already do that for you for the most part. So it's not something that you have to worry about too much. It's not a crazy heavy thing. And I think that's one of the reasons I go back and say, hey, you don't actually need a preprocessor. If you're someone that's writing sort of one CSS file and you want to try things out, that's nice. And please do that, because these preprocessors are great, and I really want you to try them out. And so if you go on to do a bigger project, you already know how to use them. But for the most part, these are used in like larger scale projects so that you can import actually different styles into one document in an easier way than the import that we saw before.
Right.
You can add in mix-ins from different files. You can have these different directives, and when you're compiling down the project, if you're already using something like Grunt or like Gulp, that'll do all of that compiling for you, and it's not something that you have to worry as much about. So lastly, I guess we should talk about, hey, I mean, there are these 3 preprocessors. Helen said a couple of things about each one, and they all seem to have like pretty strong advantages, right?
Right.
LESS, it can be run in the browser. It's super compatible with Bootstrap. It's very like CSS. That's great. SAS is so fully featured. Anything you want to do, you can do, and there's already a great network of support with Compass. And Stylus is just easy to write. It's like a pleasure to just type out a couple of words, indent it, and have that be your style sheet. So they all have their distinct advantages, but what you should think about first is, do you really need a preprocessor? If you're working on a small project, if you're not doing anything that's too complex UI-wise, maybe you don't need a preprocessor at all. And if you do want to use the preprocessors and you're thinking about trying one of these out, well, think about what technologies are you already using. If you're someone that's already using Ruby or CoffeeScript, it's probably a no-brainer. You're going to use Stylus because, hey, the syntax is just so similar to what I'm already doing, and it's not confusing me, and I don't have to get into a different mindset. If Sass is super compatible with Ruby, and you can compile things down with Ruby, it's built in Ruby, so that's something that you might want to consider. Hey, if you're a Rubyist, Sass is a great way to go. Whereas Less is it's natively compiled with NPM. So if you're like a straight JavaScript person, maybe you want that. Maybe you're already using NPM, right? And if you're just more conservative in your code writing, maybe that's something that is good too. So yeah, what technologies are you using? That'll inform sort of what your preferences are with the ease of use for all of these preprocessors. And the last one is, I said, do you prefer declarative or imperative programming? Which sounds like a very loaded question. That's a huge question to ask because, and I mean, that basically boils down to how do you want to write your loops? How do you want to sort of go into these conditionals? I would say that the way that you write these in Less is almost like functional programming.
Right.
In that you have these conditions that you'll go into, like when this happens, do this. Whereas Sass and Silence are much more the traditional sort of like declarative programming way where you say, hey, if this happens, do this, right? If one appeals to you more than the other, and this again goes back to what technologies do you already use, then that is a really great way to sort of pick the preprocessors that you want as well. Because to be honest, I love Sass, and I would pick Sass as like my preferred, except I just the control directives give me so much trouble. It's really just not intuitive for me. So I prefer something like Sass instead. But that's not necessarily the same for other people, and that's certainly not necessarily the same for you.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, the different preprocessors that we have, and that the world has.
Right, that are available.
Yeah, the major ones that are available, should I say. There are also other ones. There are also a lot of just general things in the CSS community that you can use. In the CSS world, there's not only preprocessors, there's even like post-processors that you might be able to use. I won't even get into those. There are also CSS frameworks that you can use to sort of do a lot of your grids, a lot of your resetting. Some really great ones, I think, that are popular out there. Bootstrap is obviously a great framework. Yep. It does a lot of CSS as well as JavaScript. Yep. There's also Reset. There's HTML5 boilerplate, and they're all just a lot of great resources out there.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about embarking on a new CSS project. Yep. There's no real reason to do everything from scratch like we did today. And I would, in fact, recommend that you probably don't do everything from scratch.
Yeah, and one thing to mention, just so you don't hear that and go, oh, well, then, did I just waste the entire day? When you're trying to learn something, it really is best just to get it down to its barest components and build out it that way, which is why we did everything from scratch, because we really did want to show, hey, look, this is it, all by itself, kind of keep it relatively simple, so that way when you do need to go in and tweak something, that you know how. But what Helen said is 100% correct, which is, you really don't want to sit down and just start writing from scratch. Take a look at Bootstrap. There's a great MVA on Bootstrap, but take a look at Bootstrap. Take a look at the other frameworks that are available. That after all, the best code in the world is the code that's already written. Or as a friend of mine likes to say, we're not launching rockets here. And the point that he's making when he says that is whatever it is that you're doing, somebody else has already done. So if you're trying to create an admin site, an e-commerce site, an informational site, other people have done that. Take advantage of what's already out there. So go find a framework that you really like, and then use the tools, use the skills that you've learned today to go in and make those tweaks so that you can put your own personal touch on it and make it your site. So that way your site doesn't look like every other Bootstrap site that's out there. So that's really, I think, the sort of the moral of the story, and really, I think, the moral of today.
Yeah.
So, Fantastic. All right. Well, first of all, for everybody that stuck with us for the entire day, thank you so much. Hopefully, you guys had as much fun as we did. Second of all, is I do want to highlight, because a lot of people have asked this about the source code that we've been playing around with. We've all of Helen's demos are already checked in, and one thing that I would note is, because a couple of people asked about this, the earlier demos that she was doing about adding that last little bit of style onto the site, you have both the starting point and the ending point. So that way people can go in and look at all of those. I checked in all of my demos, and they're all available right there at github.com/geektrainer/css-style. And for those of you that maybe aren't familiar with GitHub, I'll highlight the fact that right down there at the bottom is download zip. So if you just want to go grab everything, that's all that you have to do, and you don't have to install a GitHub client or anything else like that. The other big thing is you'll notice down at the very bottom of the screen, there's the one last little poll question about how much you liked us. Please do take 2 seconds and choose an option from there. And one last time, that is Helen Zhang. I am Christopher Harrison, and normally I have this thing where I would usually close out and shake your hand. I'm not going to shake your hand today. I hope you don't take offense at that.
That's okay. We can. Okay. Can you do a fist bump with the other hand?
Yeah, there we go. We can do a fist bump. Beautiful. All right. So with that, do you want to thank you guys? You are HZW?
HWZ.
HWZ on Twitter, and I am, of course, Geek Trainer. Come find us, and thanks again for tuning in.
Yeah. Bye.